We have lots to discuss in today's video, including a heavy focus on many players with the Pittsburgh Penguins. We're going to discuss the latest intel around the NHL and what NHL executives think could happen with, of course, veteran player and captain Sidney Crosby. Will he be a long-time career-only Penguin, or could we see a move? Some people think that there's a possibility that things could change sometime before the end of next year. Not expecting anything right away, but we'll also discuss the future of his longtime running mate, Evgeny Malkin, and what's going to happen there. It's expected that this could be his last year in Pittsburgh as well. Plus, of course, we know about Erik Karlsson and Rakell and Brian Rust, all players that could be sold off here by Kyle Dubas in Pittsburgh as well. A little bit more talk around the Buffalo Sabres, and if Byram ends up staying for a little while, could there be another defenseman that they move to change things up as well? Is there any appetite to change the playoff format or introduce a play-in tournament to make things more interesting around the playoffs? We'll discuss that as well coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have lots to discuss here in today's video. I want to start the video off first by talking about another longtime NHL veteran who's officially announced his retirement. Some of these players kind of wait a while after their playing days are somewhat done. Sometimes they don't know they're done right away when they, of course, first come off the ice for the last time. But Blake Wheeler has officially called it quits and announced his retirement today on social media. Of course, Blake Wheeler was the 5th overall pick back in the 2004 NHL draft, player taken by at the time, the Phoenix Coyotes. Of course, he never played for the Coyotes. He ended up staying in college for the full time at the University of Minnesota and ended up becoming a college free agent, signing with the Boston Bruins. Of course, after playing a few years with the Bruins, he ended up going to the Atlanta Thrashers. And then, of course, the Thrashers became the Winnipeg Jets. So he's been with that organization for an extended time between the Atlanta time and then becoming the Jets 2.0. Became captain there eventually, was captain for about 6 years. I think most people will probably remember Wheeler as a Jet, of course. I mean, considering the Thrashers became the Jets, and of course before that, he was pretty good in Boston early on, but he didn't spend a significant amount of time there. And then, of course, ended up finishing up with a brief 1-year stint with the New York Rangers after eventually getting bought out of the last 2 years of his contract with the Jets. Certainly a long run. Had a lot of games, almost hit 1,000 points, had 1,172 games, 321 goals, 622 assists, 943 points. I think he was hoping to get to that 1,000 point plateau, which a lot of players deem a pretty big milestone that they aim to achieve, but it just fell a little bit short. Ultimately never won a Stanley Cup either, which I know is something he still wants to do. I know he was interviewed recently on Radio Hit, and he was asked about his future, and we know that Blake Wheeler might be getting into some broadcasting in the short term. Long term, I think there's some interest, whether it be coaching or management. I don't think Blake Wheeler is interested in leaving the game of hockey. It's a huge part of his life. But I know during the most recent playoffs, he did have a small stint like a few other former and even current players did on the Sportsnet broadcast in Canada. I know they had Jake Allen on, who I suspect is considering media after he's done playing. He's done a couple of stints now during the playoffs when he wasn't in it. And then, of course, Wheeler was one of those players, and we've seen some other guys as well. He only did a few days, but I thought he did a pretty good job and certainly has interest. He basically said that he's interested in maybe getting into coaching or management role or something down the road. But right now, he still has a young family, and I think the broadcasting is probably a little bit less demanding. So I suspect at some point we'll see him, probably in the next 10, 15 years, I would suspect, in a variety of roles. But I think he's very much wanting to be involved around the game since it's such a big part of his life. So congrats to Blake Wheeler on a pretty solid career overall. I know one of the things he mentioned in that interview is that he still very much wants to win the Stanley Cup since he was never able to accomplish that as a player. He said there's different ways to get your name on that cup and get a ring, and that eventually he wants to get back into being a part of a team and having a chance to hopefully accomplish that maybe in a different role. So we certainly haven't seen the last or heard the last from Wheeler, that's for certain. One thing I thought was interesting as well on the Chris Johnson appearance on the Steve Dangle podcast on SDPN. He had a show that he did with them just here in the past, a few days ago, this past week. And they covered a lot of things, but one of the things that he had to say I thought was interesting was around the playoff format and the possibility of having a play-in type of scenario that we see in other leagues. He said the internal demand and the appetite to have a change or an introduction of this is actually very high from his conversations around various NHL executives around the league. Now, we've heard from a lot of other people that Gary Bettman is very much opposed to changing anything with the playoffs. We know that obviously the current format, as long as it's been there, it's been a big focus on rivalries and, obviously the divisional format. We see a lot of the same matchups. And I think for some people, it's, and even for some teams, I think, as much as they enjoy some of those rivalries, sometimes it'd be nice to see something different. And there's also been times where the final spots are very competitive. And look at this year, Montreal didn't clinch until the very, very end. Right, so that could be a scenario where maybe a play-in round could be, useful. But if you look at some years in the last couple of years, there's been times where if you look at the 8th place team compared to the 9th and 10th place teams, sometimes there's been big gaps. So as much as I would be for making some changes, and I would probably be for, maybe even considering a play-in type of format, I don't know. I'm not really sure. I think we need to get to a spot where, teams are consistently just barely missing out. And as the league continues to grow, I would suspect that it might become a bigger appetite for this. But Chris Johnson said he really doesn't think we're going to see changes that way as long as Gary Bettman is the commissioner, that it very well will be something, probably one of the big moves that whoever the next commissioner is makes to kind of, make their stamp on the game and maybe change things up. At least that's what he suspects at this time. But let me know your thoughts, especially if we do see expansion. We know that we're at 32 teams now. I think there's a good chance that within the next 6 to 8, 10, 12 months, sometime in the next year, I think we're going to get a formal announcement. Like I said, we know there's not going to be a formal process announced or anything like that on expansion, but it's going to happen. There's too many rich investors that are far along in the process to not have this happen. I don't think. I think Atlanta and Houston to me are as close as we could get to slam dunks. There's numerous other places as well that are very much interested and have expressed various levels of interest. And the thing with the NHL that a lot of other leagues don't have is the dynamic of how many Canadian teams that we do have here in Canada. There's 32 teams, which is a big league compared to some. But there's also 7 markets in Canada, so there's a lot less U.S. markets, tapped in NHL hockey, which I think there is a bigger opportunity there. Whereas we don't have, a big market in Canada for the NBA. We've only got the Raptors, and of course the NFL doesn't even have any teams, of course. So, it's completely different dynamic. So we'll see what happens. But I would suspect as we get expansion, if the league's going to grow anymore, that at some point they have to consider, maybe something, because we've had the same number of teams making the playoffs for a really long time as the league has grown. It would be nice to have a little bit of a change sometime here in the not too distant future. Now, in the rumor mill today, we're going to have a heavy focus here on the Penguins, but I just want to touch quickly on the Buffalo Sabres here first. Of course, we talked a lot about the last few months about the future of Bo Byram and whether or not he was going to be traded. There was a lot of belief, a lot of reports from reputable insiders really feeling that this relationship had strain on it and that Byram was looking for a lot of money that the Sabres likely weren't willing to pay. And not only that, but they wanted to make enough changes with their team that they felt he was going to be probably a pretty necessary trade piece. I've even seen some reports that when he left Buffalo for the offseason, that he basically was preparing for a move, that he wasn't likely coming back. I'm not sure if that was true, but I know that was out there. He's obviously signed a 2-year deal now. Now, the deal to me is a pretty good contract. So I don't think it completely shuts the door on the fact that he's going to fulfill this contract completely with Buffalo. I would think that there's still a chance this offseason he could be traded, although it's probably a little less likely than it would have been before he signed. And I wouldn't rule out an in-season trade or even next offseason. It's hard to say. I just don't know that, there's no long-term commitment here from either side. So it's really difficult to kind of nail down how long this relationship is going to last. But you know what they say? winning solves a lot, and strong play solves a lot. So if Bo Byram stays healthy and is a big part of that decor, which he could be, and they get some improvement on their team and they start winning more hockey games, there's probably going to be more of an appetite from his side to stay and from their side to extend him and give him a longer-term commitment. So we'll have to see. But with all that said, we know that the Sabres were not happy with their decor. Another a big part of that as well as they thought and felt, the general consensus is that their management team felt that the decor might be too young and that they might need to add some more experience in there. So, obviously even Dahlin is, a veteran. He's a young veteran, right? And then you've got Power still hasn't, a younger veteran. He's played a while, sure, but there's a lot of youngerish defensemen on this group. Byram's not that old, even looking at some of the other pieces, and the thought was that maybe they need more of a veteran presence back there. Well, obviously that hasn't quite happened. They did bring in Michael Kesselring. He's not overly old either. Obviously, a good depth right shot defenseman. I think he's going to get more of a chance to play a bigger role than he would have in Utah, and I think he might open some eyes too of how good he could be, which is great for them. Obviously, they really like this player, and I know a lot of us kind of were a little concerned over the return for the Sabres. It's not so much Kesselring. It's the fact that they got Kesselring and Doan. And I like Josh Doan, but I'm not sure that he's far enough along in his development and to be a full-time, impactful NHLer that they could have got that return for Peterka. So, we'll see, I guess, long-term how this works out. But another member of the Sabres decor, if it's not Byram, that could very well go is Mikael Samuelsson. Samuelsson is another defenseman that I think the Sabres team had a lot of frustration with. There was some talk about not only his play, but obviously there was some talk about the fact that he's a big guy, but doesn't always play like it. As a fact that he didn't stick up for his teammates, specifically the Tage Thompson incident. I know he took a lot of heat for that. And I think there was a lot of questions internally saying, can he be that guy? Is he going to learn from this, or is this going to be a recurring thing where he might be one of those big, huge defensemen that just doesn't play a big physical game? You expect that type of play from him, to step up for his teammates, to lay big hits, to be physical in front of the net. And really, are they going to get that out of him? They signed him to a long-term deal. They've seen enough to like the player early on, and I think it's fair to say that maybe they thought his development kind of stalled. There's some character issues, about can they get the play out of him that they hope for. And well, there's been some chatter that he could be a player that's on the move as well. Now, keep in mind, again, another team is going to have to really like him and think that they can get the best out of him, because he does have a long-term contract that the Sabres signed, and if they're looking to move him already, it's going to raise a lot of issues around. The league's going to be wondering, obviously, is this a risky contract to take on? So it might be less likely that we see a move, but there was chatter about him earlier in the offseason as well, and now some think with Byram signing that maybe that increases the chance that maybe they move him. But again, you want to be careful with this. A big right shot defenseman that obviously had a decent skill set that you really liked at one point. That's hard to come by. So if you move him and he figures things out and gets better elsewhere, you may regret it. So I'm not sure what they're going to do, but there is some expectation that maybe he could be a guy to go if they can find the right trade. But it would probably have to be a hockey trade, I suspect, for maybe if there's another player in a similar predicament that teams are willing to maybe swap with. But we'll see. That's going to be not easy to figure out. Now, on all of the Penguin stuff, for one, we'll talk about Crosby in a minute, but when it comes to Erik Karlsson, a lot of teams, I think, still value him and think that he's a pretty darn good defenseman. I know he gets a lot of flack for his defensive abilities, but if you look at what he's accomplished on some of the teams that he's been on the last 2, 3, 4 years, the teams haven't been very good. The last couple of years in San Jose, the team wasn't good. As long as he's been at the Penguins, they haven't been a playoff team. So, he's playing on weaker caliber teams, which means that he's got weaker caliber teammates around him that are not producing to their high levels. And yet his numbers are still pretty good. Are they through the roof? Are they a 100-point player like he was a few years ago with the Sharks? No. But he's still a really good, really creative offensive defenseman, I think, anyways, and I think there's definitely value out there. The belief is that if the Penguins are willing to retain even around $2.5 million, you can get his salary down to $6.5, $7. There's a lot of teams that like him for that price point, and they should be able to find a deal. But again, we've heard that Dubas has very high price tags on all of these guys out of Pittsburgh that he's looking to consider moving. But one team that we haven't really heard a ton about that has been linked to this player is the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, the Hurricanes do have some space that they could do something with. We know they don't have Brent Burns anymore. I mean, obviously he was, a similar type of defenseman, very creative, good offense, but he was getting older, a few years older than Karlsson. Of course, they played together in San Jose. And the other thing with Karlsson, too, is when he was in San Jose, they had Karlsson Burns. It kind of confused me as to why they brought him in. I don't know that that's really what they needed. And once Burns left, he took off, and he got a lot more offensive output. In Pittsburgh, there's been him and Letang both playing a similar role, yet he's still putting up, 50-some points. So, to be honest, if he can go to a team where he can actually be the true number one power play guy, I think he could be a fairly dominant offensive D-man still very much in this league. Carolina could be a very interesting team to watch when it comes to him. They still have some good young assets. They still have some good young picks, draft picks and young talent that they could include in a deal to kind of entice the Penguins here. So we'll see. I mean, I don't know if they'd want to move Jackson Blake. I know that name has been out there for some deals. I think they obviously really like Blake. Played mostly last year. I wonder about Bradley Nadeau. Could he be a guy? Nikishin, what are they going to do here with some of these players? Obviously Carolina's in that win now mode. They want to try to win with this group. So we'll see what happens. But Carolina might be a team to watch when it comes to him. When it comes to Rakell, we talked yesterday about LA. There's still obviously lots of others. A handful of other teams that are very much in on him. Brian Rust, I've heard about the Sabres. I wonder if would Pittsburgh be a team that might consider taking Samuelsson on if they get the right deal there? Obviously, Buffalo's got a lot going on, so we'll have to see what goes on there. But those guys are very much in play. But the bigger part of the conversation I wanted to touch on was Crosby and Malkin. And obviously kind of goes back to what Chris Johnson was talking about on the podcast here that I was referring to when he was talking about the playoff format. And the belief is around the NHL that Evgeny Malkin is done in Pittsburgh this year. The Penguins there's been numerous reports since a few months back that they have no intention of offering him a new contract. He's the final year of his deal, and that this is it for him as a Penguin. We don't know if he wants to continue playing in the NHL beyond the current season, and we don't know his thoughts on even being moved at the trade deadline or later in the season or anything of that nature. The belief is, a lot of people think with Crosby, is that he doesn't want to leave Pittsburgh and he's willing to see this through. And there's some that say he's definitely not leaving before Malkin. So with Malkin being the final season and the possibility exists of Malkin maybe being a trade piece at the trade deadline, I guess it's going to boil down to, what the offers could be. What does Malkin want to do? Would the Penguins try to force a move or not? I don't know. But he's definitely not going to leave before Malkin does. That is a pretty general consensus around the NHL. But with all the losing that the Penguins have done, and the fact that many people expect with the continuation of a sell-off here of assets on this team, that the Penguins could be even worse this year and are probably going to be near the bottom of the league in contention for the Gavin McKenna sweepstakes. I know a lot of people look at the math and look at the calendar and be like, oh, look at that. It's been 21 years. That's exactly what the time frame between Muriel Lemieux to Sidney Crosby. Another 21 years, could we go from Sidney Crosby to Gavin McKenna? Some people toss around that generational term around McKenna. I don't know if that's a little bit too ahead of ourselves here, especially for a winger. Usually you hear that term more for centermen or D-men, but you've heard that term around a guy like Alex Ovechkin. Of course, he, I think it's fair to say, was a generational talent, becoming the NHL's all-time leading goal scorer. So, McKenna could have that impact. He really does a lot of things well, and just there's really he's a player that you look at and you don't really find flaws in his game at the current level he's playing. So, he skates so well, he shoots so well, he defends well, he's got a 200-foot game, passes well, the creative, the way the thought process, and the hockey IQ is just off the charts. So we'll have to see where that goes. But clearly, him getting mentored by Crosby, for even if it's 1 year or two, could be huge for him. I don't know how the Penguins management feel about that, but so between all the losing and the fact that it's going to continue to get worse this year, a lot of people wonder, maybe not this offseason, maybe not when the season starts, but by the time we get to the Olympic break, of course, Crosby will be going with Team Canada to the Olympics. When he comes back from that, there's going to be a short stretch to the NHL trade deadline after he gets a taste of playing with some of his friends and colleagues from around the league. Could he get that itch to maybe want to go at that point? If Malkin's going to get moved, could Crosby finally say, okay? You know, we've heard about the link to the Montreal Canadiens forever. A lot of people think that he would like to finish out his career there. I can't say for certain that he wants to or not, but I know that link has been there for a long time. He grew up a Habs fan. His dad was drafted there, never played. There's a lot of connections there. You know, could he join? A lot of people would like to see him join McKinnon in Colorado for a run. Of course, those two guys are super close and would love to win together. But again, what does Sid want to do? He's going to call his own shot. It's not going to be the most, huge return to Pittsburgh, but it could bring in some assets for sure. But ultimately, the team that gets him, if it happens, would get him because he wants to go there. So it's going to reduce the trade package for sure. But there is belief, according to Chris Johnson, that with Malkin being done this year and, with the team being even worse and being bad again, that maybe, just maybe, he'll agree to be traded after the Olympic break going into the trade deadline. But again, we don't know what Crosby wants. That's all hearsay, but that's what he's hearing around the NHL. So let me know your thoughts, and if it does happen, where should he go? How could it work out? It'd be nice to see Crosby in the playoffs again. That's for sure, before he's said and done here, considering everything that he's done for the Penguins. It'd be nice to see him continue to help the league grow and be a part of the Stanley Cup playoffs again. So let me know your thoughts on all we talked about here today, and the Penguins especially, and the sell-off here of the key assets, and if that could continue to be into the Crosby-Malkin era as well. We'll discuss that further in the comment section. So if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe, stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the news, rumors, and analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.